Hello everyone, I'm the Tale Keeper, and I'm here to guide you into a peaceful night. If you're here to relax and drift off to sleep, you're in the right place. Before we begin, feel free to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps bring more soothing stories your way. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now settle in, get comfortable, and let yourself unwind as we dive into tonight's tale. The rain intensified, drumming on the roof of the bus shelter as Mia tucked herself into the corner to avoid the splashes from passing cars. The cold seeped through her coat, and she rubbed her hands together, glancing down the empty street for any sign of the bus. A faint fog was creeping in, softening the edges of the streetlights and casting everything in a hazy, dreamlike glow. It should have been calming, but instead, it made her feel isolated, as if she were the last person left in the world. She checked her phone again. The time blinked back at her. 11:59 p.m. The bus should have been here by now. She tapped at the screen, trying to bring up the schedule, but the spinning circle of a weak connection mocked her. It was late. Maybe the driver had decided to skip this stop altogether. The thought made her stomach sink. The idea of walking home in this weather wasn't appealing. The faint sound of footsteps broke the silence. Startled, she turned her head to see a figure emerging from the fog. It was a man, tall and thin, his dark coat almost blending with the shadows. His hat was pulled low, hiding most of his face, and he carried an old, battered briefcase that swung slightly with each step. Mia felt a pang of relief at the sight of another person. Being alone had been unsettling, but as he got closer, something about him made her uneasy. His movements were stiff, deliberate, as though he were forcing each step. The man stopped a few feet from her and gave a polite nod. His face was pale, his eyes shadowed in a way that the dim streetlights couldn't explain. Mia offered a faint smile and looked away quickly, pretending to check her phone again. She didn't want to seem rude, but something about his presence made her skin prickle. The two stood in silence, the rain filling the space between them. Mia found herself glancing at him from the corner of her eye. He wasn't fidgeting or scrolling through a phone like most people would. Instead, he stood perfectly still, his briefcase resting by his side. It was unnerving how quiet he was, as though he were more a statue than a person. Another few minutes passed, and still no bus. Mia felt the tension in her shoulders growing. She was about to say something, maybe ask if he'd seen the bus earlier, when the headlights appeared in the distance. The bus was finally coming. Relief washed over her, though it was tinged with an odd sense of dread she couldn't shake. The bus pulled up with a hiss of brakes, its windows opaque with grime and condensation. The destination sign was blank, which struck Mia as odd, but she chalked it up to a malfunction. The door creaked open, and the driver looked down at her. He was an older man with a weathered face and a crooked smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He didn't say a word, just waited for her to step on. Mia hesitated for a moment, then climbed aboard. The interior was dimly lit, and the air smelled faintly of mildew and something metallic. There were a few other passengers scattered throughout the seats, but none of them looked up as she passed. They were all oddly still, their faces turned away or obscured by hats and scarves. Mia chose a seat near the middle, close enough to the door to feel safe, but far enough from the other passengers to give herself space. The man with the briefcase boarded after her, taking a seat a few rows behind. As the bus lurched forward, Mia leaned her head against the window, watching the rain streak across the glass. She told herself the tension in her chest was just exhaustion. The bus was late, The weather was terrible, and the passengers were strangers. None of that was unusual. But as the vehicle rolled deeper into the night, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had made a mistake. The bus rumbled softly as it navigated through the quiet streets, the sound of the rain outside melding with the gentle hum of the engine. Mia sat stiffly, trying to make herself comfortable, but something about the atmosphere inside the bus felt off. She couldn't pinpoint what it was, maybe the dim lighting or the stale metallic smell that clung to the air, but it made her shift uneasily in her seat. She glanced at the driver, who seemed focused on the road ahead, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. There was something mechanical about the way he moved, like he was going through the motions without any thought. Her gaze wandered to the other passengers. A woman in a heavy coat sat near the front, her head resting against the window, her face hidden by a scarf. A man in a business suit was slouched in a seat across the aisle, staring blankly at the floor. The man with the briefcase, the one who had joined her at the stop, was a few rows back. He sat upright, his hands clasped on his lap, the briefcase balanced carefully between his knees. None of them moved. None of them spoke. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the bus and the muffled patter of rain. Mia pulled out her phone, hoping to distract herself, but the signal was gone. No bars, no Wi-Fi, nothing. She frowned, holding the phone up to the window, but it didn't make a difference. With a sigh, she slid it back into her pocket and leaned against the cold glass. The world outside was a blur of shadows and rain-soaked light. The streets they were passing didn't look familiar. She didn't think much of it at first. She wasn't great with directions, especially at night. But the further they went, the stranger it seemed. The buildings were older, their facades worn and crumbling, and the streetlights grew sparser, casting long, uneven shadows. She was starting to wonder if she should ask the driver about the route when she noticed a piece of paper on the seat next to her. It was folded neatly, almost as if it had been placed there intentionally. She hesitated, glancing around to see if anyone else had noticed, but the other passengers remained as still as ever. Slowly, she picked up the paper and unfolded it. The handwriting was sharp and precise, the letters tilted at an angle that gave them an air of urgency. The note read, "Rules for the midnight bus. 1. Do not speak to the driver. 2. Do not look out the windows after midnight. 3. Do not leave your seat unless instructed. 4. If the lights flicker, close your eyes and count to 10. Do not open them early. 5. If someone speaks to you who is not there when you look, do not respond." Mia stared at the note, her pulse quickening. It had to be a joke, she thought. Someone's idea of a creepy prank. But the neatness of the writing, the way the paper had been folded and placed so deliberately, it didn't feel like a joke. She looked around again, searching for any sign of who might have left it, but no one met her gaze. The man with the briefcase was sitting perfectly still, staring straight ahead. The woman by the window hadn't moved an inch. The silence felt heavier now, pressing down on her. Her first instinct was to crumple the paper and toss it aside, but something stopped her. The rules were absurd, but they also felt purposeful, as if they were meant to protect her. The last line of the note stuck in her mind, its warning echoing in the quiet of the bus. Do not respond. She folded the paper again and slipped it into her pocket, trying to convince herself it didn't matter. It was just a joke, nothing more. The bus jolted suddenly, and the lights overhead flickered. A sharp gasp escaped her lips before she could stop it. The flickering lasted only a second, but it was enough to make her heart pound. She glanced at the other passengers, expecting some kind of reaction, but they remained as still as statues. If they'd noticed the flicker, they gave no sign. Mia clenched her hands in her lap, trying to calm herself. She thought about the note. If the lights flicker, close your eyes and count to 10. She hadn't done it. Nothing had happened, but the thought lingered in her mind, gnawing at her nerves. What if there was something to it? What if the rules weren't a joke? The bus turned onto a narrower street, the buildings pressing closer together. The rain had slowed, but the fog outside had thickened, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. The streetlights became fewer and farther between, their dim halos barely penetrating the mist. Mia's unease grew with every passing minute. She had no idea where they were now, and the bus wasn't stopping. She pulled out her phone again, but it was still useless. The screen felt like a lifeline, even if it showed her nothing. She decided to try speaking to the driver. The first rule of the note echoed in her mind. Do not speak to the driver. But she told herself it was ridiculous. Rules on a scrap of paper couldn't dictate what she did. Taking a deep breath, she stood and walked slowly toward the front of the bus. The driver didn't react as she approached. His hands remained firmly on the wheel, his eyes fixed on the road. Mia hesitated for a moment, then cleared her throat. "Excuse me," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Can you tell me where we're headed? This doesn't look like my usual route." The driver didn't respond. His grip on the wheel tightened, the knuckles turning white. Mia's stomach twisted. She stepped closer, trying to get a look at his face, but the shadows made it hard to see. His eyes seemed wrong somehow, too dark, too empty. She backed away quickly, returning to her seat. Her hands were shaking now, her pulse racing. She told herself it was nothing, that he was just focused on driving, but the rationalization felt hollow. The driver's silence, the flickering lights, the eerie stillness of the other passengers. It all felt wrong. She glanced at the folded note in her pocket, and suddenly wished she'd taken it more seriously. As the bus rolled deeper into the fog, Mia's grip tightened on the edge of her seat. The world outside the windows was a blur of shifting shadows, and she couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. The bus continued its slow, monotonous journey through the fog-drenched streets, the sound of the engine humming steadily beneath the sporadic tapping of the rain against the windows. Mia sat frozen in her seat, her mind circling back to the strange rules scribbled on the note. She couldn't shake the feeling that the silence of the other passengers wasn't just indifference. It felt deliberate, as though they were all holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. She glanced around again, her eyes lingering on each passenger. The woman near the front hadn't moved at all, her scarf covering most of her face, her head tilted slightly toward the window. The businessman across the aisle was still slumped forward, his briefcase clutched loosely in one hand. And then there was the man who had joined her at the stop. He hadn't shifted position either, his back straight, his hands resting on his knees with the briefcase between them. None of them acknowledged each other. None of them seemed to notice her. Mia began to feel like an intruder, an outsider in a space where she didn't belong. The tension gnawed at her, each passing second making her regret stepping onto the bus. She tried to focus on the world outside, but the fog was so thick now that she could barely make out the shapes of buildings and trees. The headlights of the bus cut weakly through the mist. revealing little more than the slick, glistening pavement directly ahead. A sudden sharp noise broke through the hum of the engine. A cough. It came from the man in the business suit. Mia's head whipped around, her heart jumping in her chest. The sound was startling, like a splash of cold water in the oppressive silence. The man straightened slightly, rubbing his neck. Then, to Mia's astonishment, he spoke. "Driver," he called, his voice strained and gravelly, as though he hadn't used it in years. "Where are we going? This isn't my stop." The driver didn't respond. His hands remained fixed on the wheel, his head tilted slightly forward as if he hadn't heard. The man shifted in his seat, his frustration evident. He raised his voice. "I said, where are we going? This isn't the route." The bus lurched suddenly, a violent jolt that sent Mia gripping the edge of her seat. The businessman slid sideways, catching himself on the armrest. The other passengers didn't react, not even a flinch. Mia's eyes darted toward the driver. His hands were gripping the wheel so tightly that his knuckles were bone white. But he didn't turn or say a word. The businessman stood up, his briefcase dangling from one hand as he staggered toward the front of the bus. His footsteps echoed in the confined space, loud and unsettling. Mia wanted to tell him to stop, to sit back down, but her voice caught in her throat. The note's warning flashed in her mind. Do not speak to the driver. Her fingers tightened around the crumpled paper in her pocket, but she didn't dare pull it out now. The man reached the front of the bus and leaned toward the driver, his voice sharp and accusing. "Hey, I'm talking to you. Where the hell are we going?" The driver's head turned slowly, unnaturally, as though he were a puppet being manipulated by invisible strings. Mia couldn't see his face clearly from her seat, but she felt a chill crawl up her spine at the way the businessman recoiled slightly, his shoulders tensing as if he'd seen something he didn't expect. "Sit down," the driver said, his voice low and guttural. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a command. For a moment, the businessman hesitated. His hand gripped the railing by the driver's seat, his knuckles pale. Then, shaking his head, he muttered something under his breath and took a step back. He didn't return to his seat, though. Instead, he stood in the aisle, glancing back at the other passengers as though looking for support. No one moved. No one even looked at him. "This is insane," he said, louder now, his voice echoing in the stillness. "Is anyone going to say anything? Are you all just going to sit there?" Mia's eyes darted to the other passengers. The woman at the front remained motionless, her face still turned toward the window. The man with the briefcase didn't so much as glance up. It was as though they hadn't heard him at all, as though they were frozen in time. The lights overhead flickered suddenly, plunging the bus into darkness for a split second before they buzzed back to life. Mia's heart pounded as she remembered the rule. If the lights flicker, close your eyes and count to 10. She hadn't done it. She couldn't even think clearly enough to act. Her gaze shot back to the businessman. He was staring at the driver again, his expression a mix of anger and confusion. "What kind of bus is this?" he demanded. "You can't just..." The bus screeched to a halt. The sound was deafening, a metallic wail that rattled the windows. Mia was thrown forward slightly, catching herself on the seat in front of her. The businessman stumbled but stayed on his feet. The driver stood now, his figure towering over the smaller man. Mia couldn't see his face fully, but the way he moved was wrong, jerky and unnatural, like a marionette pulled by strings. Without a word, the driver raised one hand and pointed toward the door. The businessman's bravado faltered. He glanced around the bus again, his eyes wide, as though seeking some kind of reassurance or explanation. When none came, he shook his head. "I'm not getting off here," he said firmly. "This isn't my stop." The driver didn't respond. He simply kept pointing. The door hissed open, revealing nothing but darkness and fog outside. The rain had stopped, but the street beyond was shrouded in an impenetrable gloom. Mia strained her eyes, trying to see where they were, but there was no recognizable landmark, no sign of life, just endless, suffocating mist. The businessman hesitated, his defiance wavering. "You can't make me get off," he said, his voice shaking now. "I'm staying right here." The driver stepped closer, his shadow falling over the smaller man. Whatever the businessman saw in his face made him stumble backward. Without another word, he grabbed his briefcase and bolted toward the open door. He disappeared into the fog, his footsteps fading almost instantly. The door hissed shut. The bus started moving again. Mia's eyes were glued to the empty aisle where the businessman had stood. The air felt heavier now, thicker, as if the bus itself had swallowed him. She turned to look at the other passengers. The woman by the window hadn't moved. The man with the briefcase was still sitting perfectly still. No one seemed to notice he was gone. Mia sat frozen, her eyes darting toward the fogged-over windows. She thought she might catch a glimpse of the businessman outside, maybe see him walking along the street or trying to wave the bus down. But there was nothing. No movement, no sound. Just the endless gray mist pressing against the glass, like it wanted to seep inside. Her hands trembled in her lap as she replayed what had just happened. The way the driver had moved, the way the man had fled. It all felt surreal, like a half-remembered nightmare. She wanted to convince herself that the man would be fine, that he'd find his way home or call for help. But a deep, gnawing sense of dread told her otherwise. He was gone, not just off the bus, but gone. She glanced at the other passengers again, desperate for some sign that they'd noticed what had happened. The woman at the front still hadn't moved. Her scarf obscured her face, but Mia could just make out the outline of her profile, unmoving and unnaturally still. The man with the briefcase sat rigidly upright, his gaze fixed straight ahead. No one said a word. It was as if the businessman had never existed. The lights overhead flickered again. This time, Mia's body reacted before her mind could catch up. She squeezed her eyes shut, her breath hitching as she silently counted. 1, 2, 3. She reached 10 and opened her eyes cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. The lights were steady again, but something felt different. The bus's engine hummed steadily, but the sound felt quieter now, muted, as though they were traveling through a vacuum. The world outside the windows was darker than before. The faint shapes of buildings and streetlights had vanished, replaced by a swirling black void punctuated by faint streaks of gray. It wasn't fog anymore. It was something else entirely, something unnatural. Mia pressed her hand to the cold glass, trying to make sense of the shifting shadows. The longer she stared, the more it felt like the darkness was staring back. She quickly pulled her hand away and turned her attention back to the bus's interior. Her gaze fell on the seat where the businessman had been sitting. It was empty now, but something about it was wrong. The seat seemed darker than the others, its edges blurred and distorted, as though it didn't belong in this reality anymore. She blinked hard, trying to shake off the illusion. But the unsettling image remained. A faint sound broke the silence, a low murmur just at the edge of hearing. Mia froze, her head snapping toward the back of the bus. The sound was faint but distinct, like someone whispering just out of sight. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone sent chills racing down her spine. She glanced at the other passengers again, hoping someone else would react, but they remained as still and silent as ever. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, like it was coming closer. Mia's breath quickened. She clenched her fists, trying to will herself to stay calm, but the sound was overwhelming. It seemed to surround her, filling the air like a tangible presence. Then, suddenly, it stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. Mia realized she was holding her breath and forced herself to exhale slowly. She turned to look out the window again, needing some kind of anchor, but the shifting darkness outside offered no comfort. She felt like the bus was drifting through an endless void, untethered from the world she knew. A soft creak drew her attention back to the aisle. Her eyes widened as she realized the woman near the front was moving. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the woman turned her head. The scarf still obscured most of her face, but Mia could see the faint glint of her eyes beneath the fabric. They weren't looking out the window anymore. They were looking directly at Mia. Mia's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to look away, but she couldn't. The woman's gaze was unblinking, cold and detached, as though she were studying Mia, weighing her, deciding something. Then, without a word, the woman turned back to the window, resuming her unnerving stillness. Mia's heart raced. She didn't know what was happening, but she knew she couldn't sit idly by anymore. Her instincts screamed at her to get off the bus, but the memory of the businessman's fate stopped her. The darkness outside felt like a trap, a place where nothing could survive. Her fingers brushed against the crumpled note in her pocket. The rules. She had ignored them before, but now they felt like her only lifeline. Her thumb traced the sharp folds of the paper as she replayed them in her mind. Do not leave your seat unless instructed. Do not speak to the driver. She realized with a jolt that there was one rule she hadn't yet broken. Do not respond to anyone who isn't there when you look. The whispering started again. Louder this time. Closer. Mia clenched her eyes shut, gripping the edge of her seat so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The sound grew louder, filling her head until it felt like her skull might split. She forced herself to count. 1, 2, 3. When she reached 10, the whispering stopped. Slowly, she opened her eyes. The bus was silent again, but something was different. In the seat directly across the aisle from her, someone was sitting. A man in a dark coat, his face obscured by shadow, sat perfectly still. She hadn't seen him board. She hadn't seen him move. But now he was there. Mia's blood ran cold. Her hands trembled as she fought the urge to turn her head to see his face. She focused on the note's warning. Do not respond. She stared straight ahead, her body rigid as the bus rumbled forward into the endless dark. The bus rolled on through the darkness, the void outside pressing against the windows like a living thing, thick and suffocating. Mia's grip on the edge of her seat hadn't loosened since the figure had appeared across the aisle. She could feel its presence, even though she refused to look directly at it. Her pulse thundered in her ears, each beat syncing with the low, steady hum of the bus engine. The other passengers were still motionless, their eerie silence compounding her fear. Mia couldn't understand how they could ignore what was happening, how they could sit there as if this journey were just another mundane commute. Her thoughts spiraled, the questions coming faster than she could process them. Was she losing her mind? Had she imagined the figure across from her? The man in the coat shifted slightly, a faint rustling sound breaking the oppressive quiet. Mia's breath hitched. She stared straight ahead, her eyes fixed on the back of the seat in front of her, willing herself not to react. The note's warning was clear. Do not respond to anyone who isn't there when you look. The bus lights flickered again, plunging them into momentary darkness. Mia squeezed her eyes shut and began counting. 1, 2, 3. The whispers returned, faint at first, like the rustling of dry leaves, but they grew louder with each number she counted. The words were indistinct, overlapping in a chaotic symphony of murmurs that seemed to come from every direction. 8, 9, 10. She opened her eyes cautiously, the bus lights steady once more. The whispers were gone, replaced by an oppressive silence that made her stomach churn. She dared a glance across the aisle, her heart racing. The seat was empty. Relief flooded through her for a brief moment before a voice, low and rasping, broke the quiet. Are you afraid? Mia's head snapped forward, her body stiffening. The voice had come from right next to her, impossibly close. It wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that made her skin crawl. She didn't respond. She couldn't. Her mind clung to the rule like a lifeline. The voice chuckled softly, a sound that felt more like a vibration in her chest than something audible. You should be. She stared straight ahead, her hands trembling. She could feel the presence beside her now, a cold, oppressive energy that seemed to press against her skin. The figure was there, but she didn't dare turn her head. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to bolt toward the door and force her way off the bus, but the memory of the businessman stopped her. The figure leaned closer, its cold breath brushing against her ear. They're all watching, you know, waiting for you to break. Mia's lips parted as if to respond, but she caught herself just in time. She pressed her hands against her thighs, gripping the fabric of her jeans so tightly that her nails dug into her skin. The figure lingered for a moment longer before the presence suddenly lifted. She didn't hear it move away, didn't see it vanish, but she felt its absence as if a heavy weight had been removed from her shoulders. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she forced herself to focus. The bus lights remained steady, and the hum of the engine continued, an unsettling reminder that the journey wasn't over. The void outside the windows shifted, the shadows twisting and coalescing into shapes that defied comprehension. Mia tried not to look, but her eyes were drawn to the movement. For a moment, she thought she saw faces in the darkness, distorted, screaming faces that seemed to press against the glass before dissolving into the mist. She pulled her gaze away, her chest tightening with dread. The man with the briefcase moved suddenly, startling her. He stood without a word, his movements stiff and mechanical, and began walking toward the back of the bus. Mia watched him out of the corner of her eye, her muscles tensing. He reached the rear door and stopped, his back to the rest of the passengers. Without warning, he turned his head, his face obscured by shadow. "It's almost time," he said, his voice hollow and distant. Then he opened the door and stepped out into the void. The door hissed shut, and the bus continued forward as if nothing had happened. Mia's breath came in shallow gasps, Her mind raced, struggling to make sense of what she'd just witnessed. The other passengers remained eerily still, their silence more unnerving than ever. It was as though they hadn't noticed the man leave, as though his absence meant nothing to them. She felt the weight of the note in her pocket and pulled it out with trembling hands. Her eyes scanned the rules again, searching for something, anything, that could explain what was happening. But the words remained the same, their cryptic warnings offering no comfort. Her thoughts were interrupted by a change in the bus's motion. The vehicle slowed, its engine groaning as it came to a stop. The door at the front hissed open, and for a moment, Mia felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this was it. Maybe the ride was over and she could finally escape. But when she looked out the window, her stomach dropped. The bus had stopped in the middle of nowhere. There were no buildings, no streets, no signs of civilization, just an endless expanse of darkness and mist. The void seemed alive, its swirling shadows pulsing with an unnatural rhythm. The air outside was thick, almost liquid, and it pressed against the open door like it was trying to seep inside. The driver stood, his movements jerky and unnatural. He turned slowly to face the passengers, his shadowed face barely visible in the dim light. His voice, when he spoke, was deep and resonant, carrying an authority that made Mia's skin crawl. "Step forward," he said. No one moved. The passengers sat frozen, their faces hidden in the shadows. Mia's heart raced as the driver's gaze swept over them, his eyes seeming to linger on her for a moment before moving on. "Step forward," he repeated, his tone sharper now. The woman in the front seat stood, her scarf still wrapped tightly around her face. She walked slowly toward the door, her steps deliberate and measured. Without hesitation, she stepped off the bus and into the void. The door hissed shut behind her, and the bus began moving again. Mia clutched the note in her hands, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She didn't know how much longer she could hold on, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't getting off the bus. Not here. Not ever. The bus moved forward, the hum of the engine blending with the suffocating silence inside. Mia clutched the crumpled note in her lap, her knuckles white. Her gaze darted to the seat where the scarfed woman had been, now empty. The space seemed wrong, like the darkness outside had seeped in to claim it, leaving a faint, lingering shadow that felt heavier than air. The driver returned to his seat, his movements deliberate and unnatural. He gripped the wheel without a word, his shoulders stiff, his head tilting slightly as if listening to something that no one else could hear. Mia forced herself to look away, fixing her eyes on the back of the seat in front of her. The rules repeated in her mind like a mantra, each one more ominous than the last. She focused on her breathing, trying to suppress the rising panic in her chest. The other passengers remained unnervingly still. The man across the aisle, slumped in his seat with his face obscured by shadow, didn't move. The briefcase man was gone. The woman was gone, and now Mia felt like the world was shrinking, the bus growing smaller with every mile it traveled. The fog outside thickened, becoming less like mist and more like an impenetrable wall. The bus's headlights barely pierced it now, illuminating only a few feet of the road ahead. But Mia couldn't look away from the windows for long. The shapes were returning, vague figures writhing in the mist, their forms twisting and contorting in impossible ways. She squinted, trying to make sense of them, but the harder she looked, the less human they seemed. Her eyes snapped back to the aisle as another sound broke the silence. A faint creak, like leather stretching. Mia's breath hitched, her body tensing. She scanned the bus, her pulse quickening. The man across the aisle was moving now, his head turning slowly, too slowly, toward her. She froze. His face emerged from the shadows, pale and slack, his eyes wide but unseeing. His mouth hung slightly open, as though he were on the verge of speaking. Mia held her breath, willing him to stop, willing him to look away. But his head tilted, his lifeless gaze locking onto hers. Her heart pounded in her chest. She couldn't look away, even as dread clawed at her insides. The man's lips moved, but no sound came out. His jaw opened wider, impossibly wide, his face distorting into something inhuman. A low, guttural sound began to escape him, like the creak of a rusted door, growing louder and more discordant. Mia's fingers tightened around the note, the rules screaming in her mind. Do not respond. Do not respond. Do not respond. She squeezed her eyes shut, her nails digging into her palms as she counted again. 1, 2, 3. The sound intensified, now a cacophony of whispers and groans that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The bus lights flickered violently, casting the interior in brief, jarring flashes of light and shadow. Mia forced herself to keep counting. 7, 8, 9, 10. The noise stopped. She opened her eyes, her chest heaving. The man was gone. His seat was empty, the shadow of his presence lingering like a smear across her vision. She blinked rapidly, her mind struggling to catch up, to understand. But there was no explanation, only the oppressive stillness that returned in the aftermath of the chaos. The bus slowed again. Mia's stomach turned as she felt it come to another stop. The door hissed open, and the void outside seemed to deepen, as if inviting her to step into it. Her hands gripped the edges of her seat so tightly that her fingers ached. She didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe too loudly. The driver stood once more, his tall, shadowed form filling the aisle. He didn't speak this time, didn't issue any commands. Instead, he turned his head slightly, as if listening again. Then slowly, his gaze fell on Mia. Her blood ran cold. His eyes weren't right, dark and hollow, swirling with the same chaotic energy that twisted in the fog outside. He raised a hand and pointed directly at her. Mia's body tensed, every instinct screaming at her to stay where she was. The void outside seemed to press harder against the windows, the fog thickening into a black mass that pulsed with malevolence. The driver didn't speak, but the gesture was clear. It was her turn. "No," she whispered, barely audible, the words slipping out before she could stop it. The driver tilted his head, his hand lowering slightly. His movements were slow, deliberate, like a predator assessing its prey. The other passengers didn't react. They sat frozen, oblivious to the silent standoff playing out in the middle of the bus. Mia's heart raced as the driver took a step toward her, his shadow falling over her seat. She clutched the note tightly, the rules blaring in her mind. Do not leave your seat unless instructed. But wasn't this an instruction? She didn't know anymore. The lines between the rules and the reality around her were blurring, and every decision felt like it carried a terrible consequence. The driver leaned closer, his face inches from hers. The smell of rust and decay filled her nostrils, making her gag. "Your stop," he rasped, his voice a guttural growl that reverberated through her chest. Mia shook her head, tears stinging her eyes. "No," she said, her voice stronger this time. "This isn't my stop." The driver straightened, his dark eyes narrowing. He stared at her for a long moment before stepping back, his shadow receding. Without another word, he turned and returned to the front of the bus. The door hissed shut, and the vehicle lurched forward again. Mia collapsed against the seat, her body trembling. Her mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion. She had broken the rules, spoken when she shouldn't have, but she was still here. The driver had let her stay. But the bus was different now. The air was colder, heavier, and the void outside seemed closer than ever, its writhing shapes pressing against the windows like they were trying to get in. Mia clutched the note in her hands, staring at the crumpled paper as though it held all the answers. But all it did was remind her of the rules she hadn't yet broken, the ones she feared she might be forced to confront before this nightmare was over. The bus pressed deeper into the void, the engine's low hum vibrating through the floor as the oppressive darkness outside seemed to close in on all sides. Mia clutched the crumpled note in her hands, her knuckles white, her breathing shallow. The air inside the bus had changed. It was colder now, dense and heavy, almost as though it carried a weight of its own. Every breath she took felt like a struggle, and the silence around her pressed in like a living thing. She forced herself to look at the remaining passengers. The woman who had been seated near the front was gone, and so was the man with the briefcase. Only one other passenger remained, the figure sitting several rows behind her. She hadn't noticed them at first, but now, in the dim light, she could make out their silhouette. A tall, gaunt figure with their head tilted forward, as if they were sleeping or studying the floor. The flickering lights made their shapes seem distorted, stretching and contracting with every burst of dimness and brightness. Mia felt her stomach churn as she watched. Something about the figure felt wrong. They hadn't moved once. Not a shift of their shoulders, not even the faint rise and fall of breath. She looked away quickly, gripping the seat in front of her for stability. The bus jolted suddenly, as if it had struck something unseen, and she gasped. Her heart pounded in her chest as the vehicle slowed, the engine groaning in protest. She half expected the driver to stand again, to turn and point at her, but he remained seated, his shadowed figure motionless behind the wheel. The bus came to a halt, and the door hissed open. Mia stared at the darkness outside, her pulse racing. The void seemed thicker now, its swirling shapes more distinct, like shadows of something massive moving just beyond the edge of sight. The space felt alive, as though it were watching, waiting. No one moved. The gaunt figure behind her remained frozen, and the driver didn't speak. Mia's hands trembled as she clutched the note tighter, scanning its cryptic rules again as if they could offer her guidance. But there was nothing about this, nothing to explain what she was supposed to do. A sound broke the silence, a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through the entire bus. It wasn't the engine. It was deeper, more organic, like the groan of a massive creature waking from a long sleep. Mia's breath caught in her throat as the sound grew louder, pulsating through the air. She turned her head slowly toward the back of the bus. The figure behind her was moving now, their head rising ever so slightly. The faint light from the flickering bulbs overhead illuminated their face, just enough for Mia to see their eyes. Dark, hollow voids that seemed to draw in the light around them. Their lips moved, forming silent words, but no sound came out. Mia's body froze in terror. She wanted to scream, to run, to throw herself out the door and into the void if it meant escaping whatever this was. But she couldn't move. Her muscles felt locked in place, her limbs heavy and unresponsive. The humming grew louder, and the figure's movements became more erratic. They stood now, their frame impossibly tall and thin, their limbs jerking unnaturally as they stumbled toward her. Mia's breath came in shallow gasps as they reached out, their long, skeletal fingers grasping for the seat in front of her. The lights flickered violently, plunging the bus into brief bursts of darkness. In those moments, the figures seemed to change, their shape twisting and elongating, their limbs stretching to impossible lengths. When the lights returned, they were closer, their hollow eyes locked onto hers. Mia forced herself to move, her body jolting into action as she scrambled out of her seat. She stumbled down the aisle, her legs shaking as she headed toward the back of the bus. She didn't know where she was going. She just needed to get away. Her eyes darted to the locked door at the very rear of the bus. It was heavy and metallic, its surface covered in scratches and dents, as though someone, or something, had tried to force it open. She remembered the note, the rule she hadn't dared break until now. Do not leave your seat unless instructed. But there were no instructions anymore. There was only survival. Mia reached the door and tugged at the handle, her palms slick with sweat. It didn't budge. She glanced back down the aisle, her heart leaping into her throat. The figure was still coming, their movements slow but deliberate, their elongated arms dragging along the walls of the bus. She turned back to the door and pulled harder, her breath coming in panicked gasps. "Come on," she whispered desperately. "Please, please." The humming sound was deafening now, reverberating through her chest as the lights above flickered again. Her hand slipped on the handle, and she let out a cry of frustration. She slammed her shoulder against the door, her entire body trembling as she fought to open it. Finally, with a metallic groan, the door gave way. It swung open, revealing a narrow staircase that spiraled downward into darkness. Cold air rushed up from below, carrying with it the faint scent of rust and decay. Mia hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside, pulling the door shut behind her. The noise above was muffled now, the humming and flickering lights fading as she descended the staircase. The steps creaked under her weight, the sound echoing in the narrow space. The air grew colder with every step, and the smell of decay intensified, making her gag. At the bottom of the stairs, she found herself in a small, dimly lit chamber. The walls were lined with strange, pulsating veins that glowed faintly, casting an eerie red light. In the center of the room stood a large, circular device, its surface covered in intricate symbols and mechanisms that seemed to shift and move on their own. Mia stepped closer, her eyes wide as she studied the device. It pulsed in time with the veins on the walls, emitting a faint, rhythmic hum that vibrated through the floor. She didn't know what it was, but she could feel its power, ancient, malevolent, and alive. The sound of the door above opening snapped her attention back to the stairs. She could hear the figure descending, their jerky movements echoing in the confined space. Panic surged through her as she looked around for a way to escape, but there was none. She was trapped. The device pulsed again, its light growing brighter. Mia hesitated for only a moment before reaching out, her fingers brushing against its cold metallic surface. The symbols shifted under her touch, rearranging themselves into patterns she didn't recognize. The hum grew louder, the light brighter, until it was blinding. A deafening roar filled the chamber, and Mia was thrown backward as the device erupted with energy. The figure on the stairs let out a guttural scream, their form dissolving into shadows that writhed and twisted before vanishing entirely. When the light faded, Mia found herself alone in the chamber. The veins on the walls were dark now, the hum of the device silenced. She climbed the stairs slowly, her legs trembling with exhaustion. When she reached the top, she found the bus empty. The driver was gone. The other passengers were gone. The void outside had receded, replaced by a faint, gray light. Mia stepped off the bus and into the misty street, the world around her eerily quiet. She didn't know where she was, but it didn't matter. She was free, or so she thought. Behind her, the bus's door creaked open again, and she turned to see its headlights flicker to life, casting long, sinister shadows across the pavement. Mia stared at the bus as its headlights flickered weakly, cutting through the gray mist that swirled around it. The vehicle seemed different now, older, more worn. The once faded paint was peeling away in long, jagged strips, revealing corroded metal beneath. The windows, fogged and grimy before, were now entirely opaque, as if whatever had been inside was locked in or concealed. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to put as much distance between herself and the bus as possible, but her legs refused to move. Something about the bus felt alive, like it was watching her, its mechanical frame hiding a sinister, sentient presence. The door creaked open again, the sound echoing unnaturally in the empty street. Cold air rushed out, carrying with it the faint, acrid smell of burnt oil and decay. She backed away slowly, her eyes locked on the dark opening. The mist seemed to shift around her, forming faint shapes that disappeared as quickly as they appeared. Her breath hitched as she thought she saw a hand, a pale, skeletal hand, emerge briefly from the swirling fog near the door. But it was gone before she could focus on it. The street around her was eerily quiet. No cars, no pedestrians, no hum of distant traffic. It was as if she had stepped into a world completely separate from her own. The buildings that lined the road were unfamiliar, their windows dark and vacant, their shapes distorted by the haze. It felt like the bus hadn't just transported her to another place. It had taken her to another plane of existence entirely. Her grip tightened around the note still clutched in her hand. The rules had gotten her this far, but they felt incomplete now, as though they were only one part of a larger, incomprehensible truth. She unfolded the paper again, hoping for some kind of guidance, but the rules remained the same, their stark simplicity mocking her desperation. The bus's engine growled to life, a low, guttural sound that reverberated through the mist. The headlights flared brighter, illuminating the empty street in a sickly yellow glow. The door remained open, an unspoken invitation, or a demand. Mia took another step back, shaking her head. She couldn't go back. She wouldn't go back. But as she turned to run, the mist thickened around her, swirling like a living thing. It pressed against her skin, cold and damp, making it hard to breathe. The shapes within the fog grew more defined, twisting limbs, elongated faces, hollow eyes. They surrounded her, closing in with agonizing slowness, forcing her back toward the bus. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "No, I'm not going back." The shapes didn't respond, but their presence was overwhelming, oppressive. The air grew colder, heavier, until Mia's lungs felt like they might collapse under the weight of it. Her vision blurred as she stumbled, her knees buckling beneath her. The note slipped from her grasp, fluttering to the ground like a discarded leaf. She turned her head toward the bus, its door still open, the interior dark and foreboding. The mist seemed to part slightly near the entrance, as if guiding her path. She gritted her teeth, refusing to give in. She didn't know what was waiting for her inside, but she knew it wasn't salvation. It was something far worse. A voice broke the silence, deep and resonant, echoing as if it came from the very air around her. "Your journey isn't over." Mia's eyes darted around wildly, searching for the source, but she saw nothing. Only the swirling mist and the dark outline of the bus. The voice came again, louder this time, reverberating in her chest. "You must choose." Her body trembled as she tried to process the words. "Choose?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Choose what?" The shapes in the mist froze, their hollow eyes fixed on her. The silence was deafening, the weight of it crushing. Then, slowly, the door of the bus began to close with a mechanical hiss. Mia's heart raced. She didn't know what would happen if the door shut completely, but every instinct told her it would be final, that whatever slim chance she had of surviving would vanish. She forced herself to her feet, her legs trembling as she stumbled toward the bus. The shapes in the mist retreated slightly, watching her with their featureless faces. She reached the door just as it was about to close and grabbed the edge, pulling it open with all her strength. The interior of the bus was darker now, the faint glow of the overhead lights barely illuminating the rows of empty seats. The smell of decay was stronger, and the air felt thick and oppressive. Mia hesitated, her hand gripping the cold metal of the doorframe. "What do you want from me?" she whispered, her voice breaking. The voice responded immediately, its tone colder now, sharper. "To finish what you started." Before she could question it further, the mist surged forward, forcing her inside. She stumbled onto the first step, the door slamming shut behind her with a finality that made her heart sink. The bus lurched forward, the engine growling as it plunged back into the void. The seats were no longer empty. Shadows occupied every row, their forms barely discernible in the dim light. They didn't move, didn't speak, but their presence was suffocating. Mia forced herself to move, her legs unsteady as she walked down the aisle. She kept her gaze forward, refusing to look at the shadows. At the back of the bus, the door she had unlocked earlier stood ajar. The faint red glow from the chamber below pulsed weakly, as if calling to her. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the handle before finally pushing the door open. The staircase was longer this time, descending deeper into the darkness. The veins on the walls pulsed erratically, their glow flickering like a dying heartbeat. Mia descended slowly, each step echoing in the confined space. The hum of the device below grew louder with every step, a low, rhythmic vibration that resonated in her chest. When she reached the chamber, the device was different. It was larger now, its intricate symbols glowing brighter, shifting and rearranging themselves in patterns she couldn't comprehend. The air was thick with energy, crackling faintly as she stepped closer. "You've come back," the voice said, emanating from the device itself. "Good." Mia clenched her fists, her fear giving way to a spark of anger. "What is this?" she demanded. "What do you want from me?" The device pulsed, its symbols spinning faster. "This place is not a destination. It is a passage. And you are the key." The room vibrated violently, the veins on the walls pulsating in time with the device. Mia stumbled backward, her mind reeling. "No," she whispered. "I'm not part of this." "You already are," the voice replied. "You stepped on the bus. You made the journey. Now you must decide." The symbols on the device shifted, forming two distinct patterns. One glowed with a faint golden light, while the other pulsed with deep blood-red energy. Mia didn't understand what they meant, but she could feel their weight, their significance. "Choose," the voice said, its tone final and unyielding. "Your choice will shape what comes next." Mia stared at the device, her heart pounding. She didn't know what the symbols represented, didn't know what would happen if she chose wrong. But the air around her grew heavier with each passing second, the walls closing in as if the chamber itself were demanding her decision. With trembling hands, she reached out, her fingers hovering over the golden symbol. The voice spoke one last time, its tone softer now, almost sympathetic. "There is no right choice, only the one you can live with." Mia took a deep breath and made her decision. Mia's hand hovered over the glowing symbols on the device, her heart pounding so hard it felt as though it might burst from her chest. The golden light seemed warm and inviting, but there was something deceptive about it, as if it promised too much. The blood-red energy pulsing from the other symbol was colder, more honest in its malevolence, a silent admission of pain and sacrifice. The words of the voice echoed in her mind. "There is no right choice, only the one you can live with." Her fingers trembled as they moved closer to the golden light. The warmth drew her in, but as her hand neared, she felt an inexplicable pull from the red symbol. It was a visceral sensation, like the tug of a strong current pulling her toward an undertow. The room vibrated violently now, the pulsating veins on the walls glowing brighter, the hum of the device rising to a deafening crescendo. Sweat dripped down her forehead as the walls around her seemed to close in. The room felt alive, breathing, waiting. With a sharp intake of breath, she forced her hand downward, pressing her palm firmly against the golden symbol. A blinding flash of light exploded from the device, engulfing the chamber in a searing brilliance that made her cry out and shield her eyes. The air grew unbearably hot, the hum transforming into an ear-piercing shriek. Mia stumbled backward, her back slamming against the cold, pulsating walls as the device shuddered violently. The veins on the walls turned a sickly yellow, their glow flickering erratically, as if they were burning out. The light dimmed slowly, revealing the chamber again. But something had changed. The device had stopped humming. Its surface, once alive with shifting symbols, was now dull and inert. The veins on the walls had faded to black, their rhythmic pulses silenced. The room felt dead, suffused with an eerie stillness that made Mia's skin crawl. She turned toward the staircase, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her legs felt heavy, her body exhausted, but she forced herself to climb. Each step was harder than the last, her muscles protesting with every movement. The air grew colder as she ascended, the silence pressing down on her like a physical weight. When she emerged back onto the bus, it was no longer the same. The seats, once filled with shadows and flickering figures, were empty now. The windows were clearer, allowing faint light from outside to spill in. The air smelled cleaner, free of the decay and rust that had choked it before. For a moment, Mia allowed herself to hope. The bus door was open, and through it, she could see a faint glimmer of dawn breaking through the mist. The light was weak, but it was there, a promise of escape, of freedom. She took a hesitant step forward, her legs trembling, and then another. Her foot touched the first step leading out of the bus, and she froze. The faint whisper of a voice stopped her. It wasn't the deep, resonant voice from the chamber. It was something softer, more distant, yet unmistakably familiar. She turned her head, her eyes scanning the empty bus, but she saw nothing. "Don't leave." The words were barely audible, a breath on the edge of hearing. Mia's heart pounded as she hesitated. The open door was right there, the mist outside parting to reveal what looked like a road stretching into a pale golden light. But something about the voice rooted her in place. "Don't leave yet." Her breath caught. Against every instinct, she turned and walked back down the aisle. The bus felt endless now, stretching impossibly long. The dim light overhead flickered faintly as she moved, her footsteps echoing loudly in the stillness. At the very back, she stopped. The door leading to the chamber was open again, but this time, the light coming from below wasn't red or golden. It was a faint, pulsing blue, soft and rhythmic, like the heartbeat of something alive but not yet awake. She hesitated, her mind screaming at her to leave, to run into the light outside and never look back. But her feet carried her forward. Descending the stairs, the air grew warmer, more inviting. The walls no longer pulsed with veins of energy. Instead, they were smooth and reflective, showing distorted images of her own face. She reached the bottom and froze. The device was no longer inert. It had transformed, its surface now smooth and crystalline, glowing with the same faint blue light that filled the chamber. Its symbols had returned, but they were softer now, less jagged, their shifting patterns almost hypnotic. "Why did you come back?" The voice was no longer harsh or commanding. It was quiet, almost human. Mia swallowed hard. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I thought I was done. I thought I could leave." The device pulsed, its symbols shifting as though it were thinking. "You chose," it said. "But choice is only the beginning." She stepped closer, her fear replaced by a strange, inexplicable calm. "What does that mean? What happens now?" The light from the device flared briefly before dimming again. "You became part of this place the moment you boarded. It is not simply a passage, it is a cycle, and now you carry it with you." Mia's stomach twisted. "Carry what?" The chamber began to tremble, the walls shifting and warping. The reflective surfaces rippled like water, the distorted images of her face merging with shadowy, unfamiliar figures. The voice spoke again, quieter now, its words heavy with finality. "You are the key. You always were." The device flared once more, and the chamber dissolved around her. The sound of rushing air filled her ears, and she felt herself being pulled upward, weightless and disoriented. When she opened her eyes, she was standing outside the bus. The road stretched before her, bathed in the pale light of dawn. The mist had lifted, revealing fields of tall grass swaying gently in the breeze. The bus was gone, leaving nothing behind but faint tire tracks in the dirt. Mia took a deep breath, the air clean and cool, and turned to look at the horizon. It was over, or so she thought. In her hand, she felt the faint vibration of something. She looked down and saw a small crystalline shard glowing faintly with the same blue light as the device. It pulsed rhythmically, a quiet reminder of the journey she had just endured. As she stared at it, a cold realization washed over her. She wasn't free. The bus had left her, but it hadn't let her go. Somewhere, faint and distant, she could hear the low hum of an engine, growing louder with every passing moment. Mia stood frozen on the empty road, the shard glowing faintly in her trembling hand. The wind carried a strange stillness, as though the entire world was holding its breath. The hum in the distance grew louder, rhythmic and unrelenting, like the beating of a drum signaling the return of something inevitable. She turned slowly, her eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the bus. But the mist had lifted, and the world seemed endless, vast, and unfamiliar. She clutched the shard tighter, feeling its faint warmth pulse in her palm. It was alive, or at least something close to it, a fragment of the strange, malevolent force she thought she had left behind. Her breath came in short gasps as the weight of realization pressed down on her. She hadn't escaped. She had only taken the cycle with her. The hum grew louder, resonating deep in her chest. She turned toward the source of the sound, her heart racing. There, on the horizon, a shadow appeared. At first, it was little more than a smudge against the pale light of dawn, but as it drew closer, its shape became unmistakable. The bus. It was different now, its form twisted and broken, like a warped version of the vehicle she had ridden. The headlights flickered weakly, casting jagged beams of light that cut through the air like blades. Its windows were shattered, the frames jagged and splintered. Yet the shadowy figures inside were still there, watching, waiting. Mia stumbled backward, her legs refusing to obey her as she tried to run. The bus slowed as it approached, the hum of its engine deepening into a guttural growl. The door creaked open with a sound that sent chills racing down her spine. From within, a voice called out, not the cold, commanding voice of the device, but something new, something familiar. Mia. Her name echoed unnaturally, carrying with it a strange blend of sorrow and urgency. She froze, her body trembling. She knew she shouldn't step forward, shouldn't answer the call, but the sound of her name tugged at something deep inside her, something she couldn't ignore. Mia, the voice repeated, softer now, almost pleading. It's not over. Her legs moved on their own, carrying her toward the bus. She wanted to stop, to fight against the pull, but the shard in her hand pulsed in time with the voice, guiding her like a beacon. As she stepped closer, she saw her reflection in the cracked windows of the bus. Distorted, fragmented, as though she were staring at pieces of herself. The door remained open, the darkness inside beckoning her. She reached the threshold and hesitated, her breath catching in her throat. The hum of the bus grew quieter, fading into a low, almost comforting vibration. She peered into the shadows, expecting to see the driver, but the seat was empty. The bus was empty. Mia, the voice said again, this time coming from everywhere and nowhere. You chose. Now finish it. The shard in her hand grew warm, its light intensifying. She felt its energy coursing through her, filling her with a strange, otherworldly power. The fear that had gripped her moments ago began to fade, replaced by a calm determination. She didn't know what she had to do, but she knew she couldn't run from it anymore. She stepped onto the bus. The door hissed shut behind her, sealing her inside. The interior was no longer the decayed, shadow-filled space she remembered. It was alive with light and energy, the walls pulsating with the same blue glow as the shard in her hand. The air vibrated with a steady hum, resonating in her chest like a heartbeat. The shard lifted from her palm, floating in the air before her. It pulsed once, twice, and then shot toward the front of the bus, embedding itself in the dashboard. The entire vehicle shuddered, the light intensifying until Mia had to shield her eyes. When the glow subsided, the hum of the engine was replaced by a new sound, a deep, resonant chime that seemed to echo through every corner of the bus. The voice returned, softer now, almost kind. "The cycle ends with you." Mia's heart clenched as she realized what it meant. She had been chosen not to escape, but to take the burden of the bus, to become its new guardian, or perhaps its prisoner. She looked out the window, her eyes scanning the endless horizon. She didn't know what lay ahead, but she understood now that her journey wasn't about survival. It was about breaking free from the cycle, even if it meant sacrificing herself to do it. The bus began to move, the world outside blurring into streaks of light and shadow. Mia sat in the driver's seat, her hands trembling as they gripped the wheel. The shard pulsed faintly in the dashboard, its light a quiet reminder of the choice she had made. As the bus traveled forward, she felt a strange sense of peace. She wasn't afraid anymore. The mist began to part, revealing a new horizon bathed in golden light. And for the first time, she felt like she wasn't running from something, but toward it. The bus disappeared into the light, leaving the road behind it empty once more. Somewhere, faint and distant, the hum of an engine began again, waiting for the next passenger to take the journey. The cycle had ended, but the story was far from over.